Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. Welcome back everyone. This week I thought I'd continue the series I've been doing on my time commanding the Royal Air Force Coningsby and talk this time in part 4 about one of the things that was without doubt a privilege of my entire career in terms of the flying side of it, and that was flying the Spitfires and the Hurricanes on the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I was going to get to do that when I joined the Air Force, or indeed right up to when I was a squadron commander in the Air Force. I didn't think that was something that was ever going to come my way. It really did, as a result of being the station commander at Coningsby. Traditionally, there is a slot on the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight for the station commander to fly if he or she wants to. And historically, that has been the case the majority of the time. I think only 2 of the people in command of the station have ever not done it that I'm aware of. And it's one of those things that I think we all look on as a huge privilege and a very special opportunity, not just from a personal flying point of view, but actually just the existence of the flight and what it actually stands for and what it commemorates in terms of particularly the World War II generation of air crew and airplanes, and celebrates this incredible chapter in the Royal Air Force's history, and keeps it alive by putting those airplanes into the air and over people's heads on air shows various and at fly past for all sorts of different events. It's a tiny unit by comparison to many. It sits with a squadron leader in charge of it as part of operations wing on the base, and the vast majority of the air crew are not permanently based on the BBMF. They are flying other things, doing other work, and come in as volunteers essentially to fly on the flight for a number of years. There are a couple of exceptions to that, the OC of the flight and a couple of other officers who are there as the team that run it, and a team of ground crew who are permanently based there on the flight as well. And they're quite specialized because they have to look after these very old airplanes, and that's a skill that doesn't really exist in normal engineering now. Obviously, big piston engines like the Merlin and the Griffin, they're not in existence anywhere else in the Air Force. So actually doing that kind of servicing and working on the historic airplanes full stop is just a bit of a niche thing. And so, funny old thing, a lot of the ground crew spend quite a long time there, and some of the pilot workup is destined to keep people there for longer as well. So particularly the OC of the flight, the officer commanding of the flight, tends to be on the flight as a volunteer pilot for a reasonable while before then taking over for a period of time in charge of it. And that's to enable them to build up enough hours to be able to credibly fly the airplane in some more demanding conditions. So actually doing the air tests after winter servicing, that's the job of OC BBMF, when it's most likely that things won't work quite as expected. And obviously you want someone who's got a reasonable amount of time on the airplane. And I'll get back to the hours thing in a little while, talking about how much or how little flying we relatively got when we were doing it. I want to talk quite a lot about my own time on the flight in terms of flying on it, but I think just to set the backdrop, it's worth giving you a bit of context as to what is on it and how it's all structured. And in the time I was there, we had 5 Spitfires, we had 2 Hurricanes, we had a Lancaster, we had a Dakota, and we had 2 Chipmunks. They actually acquired an additional Spitfire subsequent to that time. But tragically, obviously, as I'm sure many listeners will be aware, earlier this year in 2024, they lost one of those Spitfires in a crash that very tragically killed the pilot, Squadron Leader Mark Long. But that's it. That's the set of airplanes that are there. They're all different. Looking specifically at the Spitfires, there's 2 Mark 19s, but there's a Mark 2, a Mark 5, was a Mark 9, that's the one that crashed, and there's a Mark 14, which is the one they recovered and built after my time. And there are 2 Hurricanes, which are the same mark. Both of those airplanes are actually post-war aircraft. The Spitfires, though, have some very special provenance. The Mark II, the oldest airworthy Spitfire in the world, flew in the Battle of Britain and still has the bullet holes to prove it. It was shot down in the battle, repaired, rebuilt, put back to flying condition, and still you can see those repair marks on the wing today. The Mark V flew on the Dieppe raid in the Second World War. The Mark IX, tragically the airplane that was lost this year, flew on D-Day. And the other airplanes, although they didn't fly operationally in the Second World War, they were still very operational airplanes. The Lancaster is a post-war airplane with an amazing pedigree and is one of only 2 Lancasters flying in the world today, the other one being in Canada. And the Dakota, which is essentially used as the training workup airplane for getting pilots and crews generally onto the Lancaster. So they progress through the Dakota and then onto the Lancaster, much as the fighter pilots do that by going through the Chipmunk and then onto the fighters. And I'll come back to that in just a second. So that's the kind of construct. It's a relatively unique organization as well in that it has a visitors center outside the wire, which obviously is open to the public. That's the whole point of it. The whole flight is based right next to the fence. So we have a very active spotter community, aircraft enthusiast community, who will come along and watch anytime there's any activity going on with the flight and be looking through the fence and chatting away to us. And we would regularly talk to them. And the visitor center visitors could come through the wire in under controlled conditions into the hangar to actually have a look around at the airplanes when they were there. And the flight was very seasonal as well, which is obviously also unusual for an RAF unit. Normally they work all year round. The essence of the Battle of Britain Memorial flight is it's a spring, summer, autumn thing. And the winter, they're in maintenance. All the aircraft get maintained to death over the winter to make sure they are fully fit and preserving their life as best we possibly can. Some of that maintenance is done on the base. Some of it's done off the base by third parties, because obviously, again, that expertise thing is really important in terms of having the right people who've got the right kind of historic maintenance capability to do that. So typically, between around November and March, things are pretty quiet on the flight, and were in my time for sure. And that's when we were doing all the maintenance. The airplanes would be in pieces in the hangar. They would look a bit sorry for themselves, but basically they were all taken to bits and then have a good going over, and then we're put back together again. Over the display season, though, the hangar was a very, very lively place because obviously it had all those airplanes, or as many of them were that were serviceable at any one time, all ready to go and in there. And it was just a sight to behold. It was always a very special treat to have a walk around that hangar and just have a sense of the sheer history that was in that one location. And that was without doubt pretty special. Changing tack a little bit and talking about actually flying on the flight. So most RAF pilots these days don't have any tail wheel experience. So they've never flown airplanes with a tail wheel and main wheels. Normally they're flying on what's called a tricycle undercarriage. So it's got a nose wheel and main wheels. And that's true on training airplanes and also on operational types. And tail wheel airplanes have some very different characteristics, particularly in terms of handling them on the ground to tricycle undercarriage airplanes. So the first thing we needed to do was basically get up to speed and capable of flying in a tailwheel airplane, because obviously the Spitfires and Hurricanes were firmly in that mode. And that's what the Chipmunk was for. So we started by doing some flying in the Chipmunk, quite a bit of it actually, about 25 hours in the Chipmunk total. The first 15 hours was in the front seat. And then we did a backseat conversion to become a backseat captain and could fly in the backseat. And we had a couple of pilots who weren't actually air qualified on the airplane, who were qualified to start it up in the front. You couldn't do that from the back. Everything else you could do from the back. So once the airplane was started, you'd go out and just go and fly it and learn to fly it from the back seat with just somebody in the front, just to kind of do that startup process. The reason we did that was the view from the back was a little bit more representative of the Hurricane and then the Spitfire to come. And I can remember thinking at the time when I was going through all this and starting out on the Chipmunk that it was a bit of a handful, really, to get used to it and to land it well and to land it nicely on either hard runways or on grass. And you definitely felt that, okay, this is going to be a big step up when we move to the historic airplanes. But I then get in the back of the Chipmunk and the visibility is much more restricted. You can't see very much. You have to weave to taxi. So you're weaving left and right on the taxiway so you can actually see where you're going and make sure there's nothing ahead of you. And obviously you've got the nose and you've got a big propeller on the front of the nose. So you need to make sure there's nothing out front. And at the time I looked at that and I thought, wow, this is quite tricky, really. And then once I actually got in the historic airplanes and started flying those, I wondered why on earth I'd ever thought the Chipmunk was difficult, because it was a completely different problem set when you're in the actual airplanes you're going to go and fly and display. So we did that chipmunk thing, and that was lovely for me as the station commander, because it meant that really from the moment I arrived, I started doing that chipmunk workup, and we were very weather dependent. We could only fly in good weather and with pretty light crosswinds. So we needed to maximize every opportunity that the weather was good to go and do that flying. So I would whiz off from my office down to the Battle Memorial flight very regularly to go and just get some time in and just to build some hours and experience with a tailwheel airplane. And a lot of that was just general handling. It was get airborne, go fly somewhere around the immediate vicinity of the base, to go and do some aerobatics and some spinning and some stalling and just some navigation and fly it around and have fun. And we could fly passengers on that, which was a great opportunity as well. And I loved that. It was really a really lovely thing to be able to do, even when I was well and truly flying on the flight proper. Go and take the chipmunk up for a bit of currency flying, and particularly on something like a Friday afternoon, after a busy week in the office, that was just a wonderful, wonderful way to finish off the week. And it was just such a fun little airplane to go and operate. But once we got through the 25 hours on the chipmunk, then where next? So we actually wanted to have something of an interim step between that and going and flying on the Spitfires and Hurricanes. So we went and flew the Harvard, another old historic training airplane, which the Air Force doesn't own any Harvards. So we went down to Duxford, and we actually bought a couple of hours in the Harvard at Duxford. And we flew with the Aircraft Restoration Company in their airplane, and we did a trip in the front and a trip in the back, and we flew off hard runways and grass runways. And essentially that was a bit of a sign-off check by the Aircraft Restoration Company. John Romaine, very experienced historic airplane pilot, who would give his view on our kind of readiness to then get into the proper machines. And if you like, it was the driving test. It was essentially, right, are you now ready, or do we need to do something else? And most people, of course, pass the driving test, which is great. And you're then off to go and have a look at the real airplanes. But you don't just jump straight into a Hurricane or a Spitfire. What we did first was we did what's called a tied down engine run. So we could actually tie the tail down, physically tie the tail down to a hard point on the ground. And you could run the engine up all the way up to takeoff power. It's how we do engine run checks and engine tests on the airplane as well. We would do that. We'd actually get in the airplane with OC BBMF sat on the wing and go through the pre-start checks and the startup routine, and then everything up to and including the takeoff routine, and run the airplane up to takeoff power. Why? Because it was a wholly different sensory experience to flying anything I had ever flown in the Air Force before. Just the startup alone was immense in terms of the noise, the vibration, the smells of this old historic airplane. You had to be a bit careful on start. If you over-prime the engine, put too much fuel in the engine before you start starting it up, you get flames coming out of the exhausts, which if you're not careful can actually then get worse. So you have to really think about how you're actually managing the startup process. And there's a chunk of things that can go wrong. They are old, they're finicky, they have old instruments. And they're pretty simple by design in terms of the actual quantity of stuff that there is to do. But there's equally lots and lots of things that are just totally and utterly unfamiliar. But you do that tie-down engine run, and then that's it. There are no two-seaters, so you're off. And the next thing was on the 11th of April 2005. That was my Hurricane solo. And it was, fairly comprehensive briefing, and obviously OC BBMF keeping a very good eye on you when you're going and doing that. And you go and launch off and go and fly for a bit. And I mean, I'd been flying a lot by then. I had a lot of hours on airplanes and a lot of experience. And I'd flown in a lot of operational flying and all sorts of different environments. And so I considered myself pretty competent. But I have to say, I got airborne in the Hurricane, and I think I left my brain on the ground when I did it. It was just such an extreme difference to anything I'd done before. Luckily, I collected my brain pretty quickly and got back sorted out, and off we went, and had an hour's worth of flying. Some away from the airfield, we go and practice some stalls, so kind of mini emergency procedure, see how the airplane actually handles when you stall the wing, and then also you do things like practice forced landings. So you actually go and have a look at how are you actually going to get this thing down if the engine quits, because one of the things we were always very conscious of was preserving them and trying to make sure that, even if something went really badly wrong, and the worst case probably would be an engine failure of some sort, then you had a decent chance of landing it somewhere. And to that end, all the time when we were flying around between displays and so on, we would fly around at sufficient height that we had an opportunity to get a forced landing in. So typically a minimum of 3,000 feet would be our aim to fly around at. And would practice that kind of stuff away from the airfield. And then it was back to the airfield to do circuits, which I have to say, I think it was probably one of those things you could sell tickets for the first time that people go and do this, because it is a handful. The Hurricane is a lot easier than the Spitfire, as it turns out, but that's sort of a story for later. But the airplane is most definitely a handful. And when you're not used to it and you first start doing touch and go landings, roller landings, so you're aiming to put it down on the runway and then get it nice and stable and then run it up again and go and do another takeoff, go around the circuit again, do it all again. And if there's any degree of crosswind, you need to be really on your game with any of these airplanes, particularly on the hard runways. If you're actually landing on grass, and we did that in some places like Duxford, then it was an awful lot more forgiving, and it was much easier to land it on grass. But the first sortie was most definitely a kind of learning curve, because you haven't got anybody to really tell you what's going on. Maybe you had OC BBMF in the tower who could shout on the radio if he thought there was particular hints and tips he could give you, but that's the original backseat driving. So by and large, it was up to you to sort it out, and you just had to get on and do it, and that was pretty entertaining. And the learning curve in terms of the amount of time you had to develop your skills was very, very, very small on these airplanes. They're old, they have limited hours. We want to preserve them to fly them as long as we possibly can. So the upshot of my first Hurricane solo and my hour of time doing general handling and learning to land it is that by the time I got another half hour sortie in just to go and do some more circuits and get a bit more familiar with it, and also go and start practicing the display sequence that we'd also been working up in the Chipmunk, so you knew the display sequence inside out, would practice that at height initially, and then would step it down very rapidly. And by trip 3, with a whole 1.5 hours on type, I was displaying the Hurricane at 100 feet over the airfield, i.e. at display height. So that is unthinkable in any normal airplane, and it proved the point that we used very experienced pilots who did have a lot of time, a lot of airworthiness experience, who did have a very fast ability to learn and absorb stuff and get on with it. And of course, that all works. The system's well proven, and it was it was great the way it worked. And you move pretty quickly through that. You start practicing the display. So say 11th of April was my first solo. By the time we actually got to the AOC's public display approval, then that happened later that month. And that was after 3 hours 40 on the airplane. I'm now getting approved to actually go and fly the Hurricane display in front of the public. So with a tiny amount of time, relatively speaking, on the aircraft, but that was kind of what we could do in order to preserve the airplanes. The actual display itself, you may well have seen it. If you have, then you're lucky, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't, and then you get an opportunity to watch it, then please do. It is wonderful to see these airplanes. The sound is amazing, as well as the actual sight of them. And we kept the display very simple. We would typically try and do a couple of big wing over type maneuvers with a roll underneath to turn back the other way at each end. We'd do a big circle, flat turn around, and then we'd come back around. We'd do a victory roll at the end. And it was all deliberately designed to minimize the fatigue on the airplane. We were very, very conscious of engine wear. So we use a fraction. We use about a third of the total engine power that the airplane actually had originally. And we obviously are very conservative with the amount of G we pull. If you go back to them using these airplanes operationally, then they would clearly have operated them essentially with no G meter to the point that they were graying or blacking out. So probably 6 or 7 G, maybe more than that a lot of the time, and flying them in all sorts of weather and at night, which we didn't do any of that. We just flew them by day in good weather with very limited crosswinds. And particularly for the Spitfires, the two early Mark Spitfires that we had, the Mark II and the Mark V, they had a 10-knot crosswind limit, which is an incredibly low crosswind limit. But that's because the undercarriage is incredibly narrow on an old Spitfire, and the fin and rudder at the back end is very small. So the level of directional stability, your ability to keep it straight on the runway, is very, very limited. And coupled with the elliptical wing tips on those Spitfires, wanting to fly the wing right down to very, very low speeds, it made it a real handful on the runway in any kind of crosswind, and that's why we had such a low limit. We basically did nearly all of our display flying at the weekends. We did some during the week, but obviously most air displays and fly-past type events, big public events, tend to be at the weekend. So we were flying in all sorts of conditions that we didn't normally fly in, not least when a lot of other general aviation flies around. That's when most flying clubs are most active, people with gliders, people with hang gliders, people with parascending, etc. So it was quite interesting to operate in that environment, and particularly in quite congested airspace sometimes. And we would go all over the place to do shows. The nice thing about the airplanes is they actually have pretty decent range. You could get more than 2 hours flying time out of the Hurricane, flying at 150 knots. So you could go quite a long way. And if we couldn't go far enough, we would actually go and land in other places and operate from those, and would send ground crew typically to go and operate with us. If we're up for the weekend, we didn't turn the airplanes around ourselves as we probably would have done with a fast jet. Again, because they were sensitive and they needed careful handling and maintenance, and we were conscious of that. So it was quite a bit of a roadshow involved in getting things underway. But you move quite quickly from public display approval to first display, and off you go. And then after that, it was full throttle in terms of events. We typically got about 50 to 55. I think I got 110 hours total Spitfire Hurricane over my 2 years, which is very typical for what we would actually get. So in total hours, you're not getting that much, but you're doing quite a lot of events and quite a lot of sorties. And on any given event, you could do 2 full displays and up to 8 flypasts. So 10 events that you're actually covering, 10 things that are happening, fates and smaller events where obviously there's a flypast and they've been asked for a flypast. Some big ceremonial kind of events and very special ones. Some very big air shows where we'd actually go and operate from that airfield to go and do the Farnborough Air Show or the Royal International Air Tattoo at Fairford, or big events at Duxford, which can really be considered kind of the home of historic aviation really these days in the UK. And those were amazing fun because we would actually get to operate as well in some of those events with other people. And that was just a real treat. So flying in big formations of Spitfires with lots of civilian Spitfires out there, occasionally not such big, but still very iconic, bigger formations of Hurricanes because there are a lot less Hurricanes available. And we also worked up, in the second year that I was there, we worked up a tail chase display and then a synchro display, which was operate 2 airplanes flying in a synchronized display at the same time, either usually with 2 Spitfires, but sometimes with a Spitfire and a Hurricane. And those were enormous fun as well. And some of the things we did at Duxford, where we'd actually get involved in quite big formations of Spitfires, both in close formation and then doing these kind of tail chase displays where we'd all be flying around, following each other around the sky, made for some spectacularly fun, but it also some fairly big moments in terms of flying through the propeller wash of another airplane. It really upsets yours. You end up losing all lift and all control until you're out of the wake turbulence of the airplane. Think Maverick in Top Gun 1, where obviously he flies through his jet wash. It's exactly the same with propeller wash. You can lose control quite quickly for a bit, and that can be quite entertaining. So you had to be careful about all that sort of stuff. It was just breathtaking to do, to be honest. I never, ever got tired of doing that. It was also a wonderful opportunity some of the time when we did land at air shows to go and meet the public and talk to the public about what we were doing, and obviously signed lots of autographs and signed lots of BBMF brochures and those sorts of things. But the most special thing, I think, in terms of the meeting people bit through the BBMF was the veterans. Again, we're talking nearly 20 years ago now that I started there, and there were still quite a lot of World War II veterans alive. There's clearly a lot less of them around now, and they were so special to meet, whether they were fighter guys or bomber guys, and I met a lot of both. It was just an immense privilege to have a chance to talk to them in the environment that they would have known. It was amazing how sprightly some of these 80-plus-year-old men would be when they got to jumping up to get into a Spitfire, and they'd clamber in, and it would just be like it was when they were in there. And then, of course, they suddenly realized they had to get out, and it was a bit more of a challenge getting them out some of the time. But that was so special to have an opportunity to talk to them. Another amazingly special thing with it was the Lancaster and flying the in the Lancaster. And I never did any flying of it, but I flew in it 4 times. And that was just, again, an immense privilege. One of those included a poppy drop down the Mall over Buckingham Palace on July the 10th in 2005. And that was very, very special. It was an immense privilege to do that. I was in the mid-upper turret of the Lancaster watching that when we dropped the poppies. And again, just to fly in an airplane that is so iconic and is literally almost completely unique. I mean, as I say, there are only 2 in the world that are flying. Very, very special. But I haven't talked about Spitfires. I talked about getting in a Hurricane and going flying in the Hurricane. But then, of course, you had to convert to the Spitfire. We deliberately started flying the Spitfire after having flown the Hurricane because it is more of a handful. Everyone turns around and looks at the Spitfire as the iconic airplane of World War II. The reality is, of course, there were nearly double the number of Hurricanes. They got double the number of kills. And the Hurricane guys used to get terribly upset that the Spitfire kind of got all the glory. And I can understand why they did get upset about that. But equally, the aeroplanes were totally different. The Spitfire was a beautiful, beautiful airplane to fly. You got airborne in it, and you just recognized immediately that it was just built to do what it was doing. It was much more powerful than the same engine, but the aerodynamics of the airplane meant that it was just more powerful, more maneuverable than the Hurricane was. Obviously, a lot more development of the Spitfire in terms of marks of Spitfire developed versus Hurricanes. And they were both wonderful to operate and fly in their own way. But without doubt, if you would ask me my preference would definitely be the Spitfire. And I remember I did my conversion to the Spitfire on the 11th of July, 2005. So not long after I'd done the Hurricane. We did about 15 hours and then got in a Spitfire. Luckily, at that stage, the Mark 9 airplane that we had clipped wings. It didn't have the classic elliptical wingtips. It was set up as one that had been used for low-flying ground attack and therefore had clipped wings on it, which made it significantly easier to land. It also had a big fin and rudder because it was a later Mark, so it was much more stable on the ground. So it was a great way to do the conversion and get into a Spitfire without it becoming too much of a handful. But then only a couple of trips later, I was in the Mark II Spitfire. And I can still remember Clive Rowley, who was the OC Battle Brit Memorial flight at the time, saying to me as he was briefing me for this particular sortie, he said, right, so you're going to go flying in P7350. I would remind you that it is the oldest airworthy Spitfire in the world. It is the only surviving airplane from the Battle of Britain. So please be careful with it. And I have to say the pressure was pretty immense, when you get in that airplane to go and operate it on that day. But the joy of flying that and the Mark V, actually, they were both beautiful, beautiful airplanes. And I just adored doing that. It never really got old. The challenge some of the time was you'd do a whole series of events, as I say, anything up to 10 events on a sortie. Then you'd turn around, head for home. And if you're going back to Coningsby or going anywhere else for that matter, the first thing you were interested in is what's the crosswind, particularly on days when the wind was a bit more on the limits, as it were. That was definitely a big factor for us because you really didn't want to be landing those airplanes in strong crosswinds. Largely because if you did ground loop it, if you lost control of it on the ground and did effectively it went trundling off the runway in a circle, the risk was very high that you would have overturned it and obviously done an enormous amount of damage to it, but also potentially to yourself as well. We used to deliberately land with the canopy open in order to minimize that risk to some extent. As you were going downwind, you'd open the canopy, slide the hood back. So you're flying in a cabriolet. As you go downwind in the circuit, you'd fly a reasonably tight turn around onto finals, but it was a curving approach all the way around. You'd try and keep the curve going as long as possible because the moment you rolled out, then actually what happened was you lost sight of the runway because now the nose is in the way. You're sitting with an angle of attack on the airplane that meant you couldn't see the runway. You just got to kind of keep it coming down, looking left and right a little bit and get yourself to a position where you land as a 3-point landing is what you want to do and try and do neat landings. And it was all about the landings. We were always paying very, very close attention to each other's landings and having a bit of a laugh with each other, but also your own. It was a real pride point that you wanted to make sure that you nailed it as you put the airplane back on the ground. As I mentioned right at the front end, we had 5 Spitfires. We had 3 Merlin engine Spitfires in those days, and then we had 2 Griffon engine Mark 19 Spitfires. that were the big reconnaissance airplane, much bigger engine, much bigger nose. It was almost, in terms of responsiveness, the engine was more like a jet in some ways. Very powerful. The propeller annoyingly went the other way round, so it meant that when you were using all the rudder inputs you were used to putting in for controlling the Merlin engine airplanes, you had to do the opposite stuff for flying the Griffon, and it meant that we didn't fly that till the second year. We left that into doing it into the second year, and that was, I think, that worked pretty well. It was a good thing to do. So fairly early in my second season, you did a conversion onto the Mark 19. And then we'd fly any of them. Basically, you'd fly whichever ones were available to you on the day. The 19 was lovely. It was a nice airplane to fly. It was very fast. You could tell immediately it really always wanted to go faster, and it had a lot more performance than the Merlins. But at the same time, it just, for me, didn't have the character. I absolutely loved the old Marks of Spitfire. It was the original money can't buy thing to be able to do that. And I just think that it was something that was just so special. It all came to an end, sadly for me, on October the 8th, 2006, just before the end of my tour at Coningsby. That was my last Spitfire trip, and I look at my logbook and it says 8-ship Spitfire fly past and a 6-ship tail chase at Duxford. What a way to finish. Absolutely amazing. Flying with 7 other Spitfires, obviously some of them civilian-owned, and then doing that big tail chase thing at Duxford. That's one hell of a way to sign off a couple of years that I'll never ever forget. I have memories and photographs, that has to be said, from all the people that took pictures at all the air shows, that we used to harvest those off some of the websites and talk to the spotters direct and say, could we get some better copies and things, and and memories and photographs to last a lifetime. It was just a stunning thing to do. That's it for this week. I'm conscious that's a little bit longer than I would normally make these things. I hope that's not been too long for you and you've enjoyed it. I may well come back and talk more about this sort of stuff at some point, because I think there's just other things we could dive into. No leadership lessons per se, but just some fun flying the Spitfires and Hurricanes today for all of that. Just before I sign off, if you have enjoyed this episode, and I really hope you have, then not only would I love you to give me a review on whichever podcast platform you're listening to this on, but I would really love you to support the podcast and think about actually helping me to continue it. You'll find a link that says support the show in whichever podcast platform you're using. Alternatively, you can actually go to www.patreon.com, patreon.com/leading4life. And then you'll find a supporter site for what we do. And if you're up for it, you can do a very small financial contribution per month that will really help me to continue doing this and justify the time and effort and all the rest of it that it takes. So that would be lovely. But I hope you've enjoyed it either way, and it won't be long till the next episode. See you soon. Bye.